Awesome. All right, well then let's go ahead and dive into testing NGRX with marbles. Show of hands, how many people are using NGRX? Okay, so we've got about half people in the room. This is not going to be like an intro to NGRX presentation, though we could probably do one at this meetup sometime. So this is kind of assume that you know some of the fundamentals of NGRX, right? Actions, effects, and reducers are kind of some of the main fundamentals. Just a quickly high-level overview. NGRX is a way to do state management in your Angular applications. Kind of rips a lot of the logic for state management out of your components and encapsulates it in these actions, effects, and reducers. You dispatch actions to what's called a store. Actions might be like load user or load users or select a specific user or open a sidebar or drop down a nav, anything that's changing kind of the state of your application. And then there's a reducer, which will kind of take that action and then mutates the state. The state is a single source of truth for all of the state management of your application. And then we also have effects library, which allows us to do side effects, which is primarily asynchronous code, and allows us to do it in a very modular and reactive way. Here's a slide about me. That's my name, Brian Love. I'm the CTO of Breebug. You can check out my blog, brianflove.com, where I blog about mostly Angular and NGRX. And feel free to tweet at me, Brian_Love. And you can follow me if you want. That would be cool. I got some demo files we're going to be looking at. I also hope that this will serve, if you kind of aren't using NGRX today, but you will in like the next 6 months or whatever it is, and you're like, hey, we need to write tests for our code. That would be a good thing. And your manager agrees, and it's like, that's a good thing. Let's write tests, right? Then maybe you can go check out this repository. I have a whole bunch of example code that I've written. It's a very basic application, so it's not anything amazing, but the testing, there's tests against all the components, all the actions, effects, and reducers, and everything. And we'll see that tonight. So feel free to check that out. It's on my GitHub page, github.com/blove. All right, cool. Let's quickly talk about the stack that I'm going to be using tonight. I'm going to use Angular 6. Might as well play with the latest bits. I'm going to be using NGRX. I'm actually going to be using a beta release of NGRX 6, beta 1, at the time of this presentation. I'm also going to be using a test runner called Jest, rather than the built-in test runner in Angular, which you might be using now, which is called Karma. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. This also kind of hooks into this preset called jest-preset-angular. This is an NPM module, or library, if you will, that allows you to really hook up Jest pretty easily, quickly to Angular. So that way you have basically zero config to install Jest. I'll be using Jasmine marbles. We're going to be doing marble testing. We'll talk a lot about that. And I'm also using this library called Faker, which just fakes out data for me. Names, numbers, addresses, it just generates fake data. So you might be sitting there right now and you're like, hold on. So wait, we're not using Karma? That's what comes with Angular when I ng-new, right? Yes, Karma comes with ng-new or with Angular CLI when you build an Angular app. And there's nothing against Karma. I think it's a fine test runner. But it also has its downfalls, and Jest is a great library that Facebook put out that we can use. And so you might be saying, well, why Jest? And because it's actually like super fast. And I don't know about you, but like unit testing is not my favorite thing to do. Let's all be honest. Maybe you're in the same boat as me, or maybe you love writing unit tests. That's fine. Will you come write my tests for me, please? But one of the things I don't like about Karma is it's really slow, right? It's got to like start up Chrome and run through all these tests, and I just sit there and wait for it, and so I don't have to do that with Jest. So I'm really happy about that. And so one of the reasons why it's really fast is it actually doesn't use Chrome or even headless Chrome. It uses a library called JS-DOM, which basically just mocks out the entire DOM in JavaScript. It also executes all our tests in parallel, so it's really fast. So we don't need Karma, and we can configure it with basically zero config with Angular Jest preset. So if you're not doing testing now, and you're looking to get into doing testing, even not NGRX, I would strongly recommend that you check out Jest. I'm not going to be talking tonight about all the specifics of Jest and installing it and everything. That's honestly another talk, and there's lots of stuff online. So feel free to check it out. Okay, cool. Got that out of the way. All right, here we go. Testing NGRX actions. So we don't really need to test our actions. Actions are really just these dumb objects, if you will, almost. The only actual thing that you need on an action is a type, which is a string that kind of tells NGRX, hey, this action is of this type. So there's really no need to test that. And any testing that we do when we test dispatching of actions and we test our effects, we'll cover that. So even though you may not directly test your actions, in your coverage reports, you'll see that those lines will be covered because you're testing them indirectly. But we do need to think about, well, maybe we need to test the NGRX reducer, right? So a reducer is our peer function in NGRX that mutates the state. And so we probably want to actually start testing that state mutation. If I dispatch this action, I should expect the state to be mutated as such, right? I'm going to show you some example code. Obviously, we're going to do a lot of code here tonight. But you will see that I am actually going to be testing some of the state mutations for the entity library. And I'll talk about that briefly, but we probably don't need to. If we're using the entity library as part of NGRX, we can probably trust that it's already been tested and battle tested in production and in projects around the world. But we do want to assert that no state mutation for invalid actions happens, and we want to assert that state mutation happens for valid actions. So let's go ahead and assert a no-op action. Here we're going to basically, so I'm using Jest, but its syntax is, I would say, 90% or very close to Jasmine. So if you're used to writing tests using Jasmine, they should all look and feel very familiar. But I'm basically going to wire up a dummy action. It just needs a type, like I said before. And I'm just going to call it no-op because I don't have any action that actually is that. And I'm going to call my reducer function. And I'm going to start with an initial state of undefined and pass in this action. And what I'm going to expect is I'm going to expect that the result that comes out of there is just going to be my initial state. Because that's what I'm kind of expecting. Because nothing should happen. The state should not be mutated because the action is basically invalid. But here I'm going to go ahead and assert a valid action. So here, this should look very much familiar if you're using NGRX. I'm going to new up an action called add user. I'm going to give it a payload of a user object. I'm going to go ahead and call the reducer. I'm going to provide in the initial state to the reducer, just like we would expect, and dispatch and provide the action that is going to mutate the state. And then I'm going to basically assert or expect that the result that comes out of that reducer function is going to equal, and I'm going to spread the initial state, so it's going to be exactly what we started with. Plus, I expect this action to set error to undefined and loading to true. Let me real quick just show you those actions, so that way it kind of makes sense. Let me bump this up. So I've got in this demo repository, I've got a state folder. And then inside there, I've got some of my root state that's being set up. And then here's my user. That's just kind of the demo. And then I've got my action. So if we look at that add user action, you can see here, I've got my type here, and it's expecting a payload of a user. And then if I look at my reducer function for this, oh, that's the test. You can see that inside the switch statement, I'm switching on the type, and then for all of these types, basically adding and loading, all I'm going to do is I'm going to just take the state that was received, I'm going to spread that, and I'm going to mutate it, set loading to true, and error to undefined. And that's where you can see back in the expect statement, I'm basically expecting that error to be undefined and true, and validating that my reducer is working correctly. So that's how we. We will also do our success and fail actions. So when we add a user or when we load a user, usually as a result of that action, we usually have kind of a tree, right? So either afterwards it was successful or it was a failure. Especially if it's like an asynchronous action that we're doing against a REST service.
Question.
Yeah, sure.
Would you also test that you're not mutating the data, the state?
For an invalid action?
No, for any interactions, just ensure that none of your reducer function is actually mutating data inadvertently.
Oh, I see what you're saying. You know, you could test for that. That's a good question. And that might be a good test to write. But what I do instead is I use the NGRX store freeze in development, and it's not, yeah, it would be, to answer your question, it would be a good idea to do that, probably. Yes. I didn't do that in this case. But there is the NGRX store freeze library, which will it'll run in development, it'll throw a runtime exception when you actually mutate the state object.
Oh, okay.
And one of the things is that's maybe hard to test. I mean, I'd have to get into the details of it because you could mutate the state really anywhere, right? You can mutate the state. I mean, you're only supposed to mutate the state in the reducer, right? Okay. And even then, we don't actually mutate the state. Yeah. We spread it and we return a new state object. So it's always a new object that comes out of it. We never mutate the actual state object. That's why I spreaded it, right? But if you look, there's an NGRX store freeze. I don't know if I added it in here.
And you remove that in production?
Yeah, you do not want to run that in production. I didn't wire that up into this project. But yeah, NGRX-store-freeze is the name of it. And you basically only run that when your environment is in development, based on your environment flag, right? And you don't want to run that in production because it's going to do extra work to actually freeze your objects. And so there's really no reason technically, as long as if you're doing it right, once you get to production, there's no reason to actually freeze those objects and doing that extra work in the JavaScript virtual machine, sure. Right? So it'll call object.freeze on everything for you. Yeah, and you'll basically get an error in the console because object.freeze just freezes an object. In the console you'll see an exception that says you tried to mutate a frozen object or whatever it says, immutable object. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions before I get back into it? Feel free to interrupt me at any time too, by the way. Just say hey. All right, cool.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Back when the state was no-op,
yeah.
If that's not a valid action, would that throw an exception or?
No, what will happen actually, if we look at our reducer, it'll just return the same state. So in your reducer file, you're going to get a state and an action to mutate the state against. And at the bottom, most of the time at the bottom, anytime either it doesn't match, you're just going to return that same state object out. So what that test is doing is it's validating that this runs. It's basically sending in an action that's not pertinent. That's why I just call it no-op. Okay. Yep. Yep. So that way that's covered. All right, cool. Yeah, so we asserted add user. Now let's go ahead and assert add user success. We're going to use our reducer function, give it an initial state and an action. The action, we're going to new up add user success and give it a payload of the user. And then we'll just do this same kind of thing. I am using the entity library. At NGRX/entity, it's very helpful if you're not using it to manage collections of entities in your NGRX store. So that's why you're going to see this entities here. So you can see I'm going to expect my new state, my result. I'm going to spread initial state. And then I'm going to expect in my entities object or dictionary, I'm going to expect to have a new object whose ID is that new user ID that I added successfully and that user object. And then I'm going to also expect that that IDs array now has the user ID in it and that we've toggled loading to false. So if we go to the code and actually look at the reducer for that success, I'm not changing the entities dictionary or the IDs, but that's what's going to happen kind of behind the scenes when I call, let's add users. Let me see, where's add user? When I call add one here and give it the payload, the user object, it's going to mutate the state that I give it. and it's going to add the entity into the entities dictionary, and then also put the ID into the IDs array. And then I'm going to go ahead and toggle loading to false.
That's what that adapter is doing. It's kind of doing that behind the scenes for you.
Yes. So that's actually kind of a whole nother talk, actually, like doing
Is
the.
that part of the entities library?
It's part of the entity library. Yeah. And so if you look in the Redux Dev Tools and you look in your state, this add one on the adapter, there's basically like add one, add many, remove many, update many,
Okay.
and a couple more there. That basically adds, removes, and updates entities in a collection of those of entities, right? So let's say I've got whatever your app is. In this case, I have a collection of users that I'm managing, right? This allows me to basically add users, and remove a user.
Without having to write all the boilerplate.
Correct. Yep. So if you're not using the NGRX entity library, you're probably writing a bunch of, you call it boilerplate, whatever it is, kind of repetitive-ish code,
Yeah.
where you're doing a lot of spreading of state and adding things into arrays and splicing arrays and all this kind of stuff. So this does it for you. Yep. So if you're not using the entity library, I'd strongly recommend it. There's a ton of talks online about it. We could do one here at the Rocky Mountain Angular meetup. I think Jesse did about 6 months or a year ago. You could check that out on YouTube, or there's a lot on using the entity library. So that's what I'm using here. And that's why I'm testing out kind of those entities and IDs.
And that's part of 6, isn't it? Or
That came out with NGRX recently, maybe 6 months ago.
I mean, is it officially part of it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It was back in October.
Yeah, back in October of last year.
5. Then.
Yep. So if you go to the NGRX website here, actually, let me see, how do I get out of full screen? I think, is it F? So if you just do NGRX and go to their platform page, you can find a bunch of information about it right here. So it's an entity state adapter for managing record collections. Check it out. It's very helpful. Cool, and then we're gonna go ahead and also assert our add user fail, kind of go into that tree, if you will, cover that part of our reducer function. So all kind of the same stuff here. We're gonna new up add user fail, give it an error object. We're gonna reduce, call reducer, give it the initial state again, and this action against that state, and then we're just gonna expect that we get this error in our state, basically, and loading gets toggled to false. And if you look at that reducer in the switch statement, that's all it does is basically spread state and then sets an error and toggles that loading flag. All right, duplicates there. Okay. So like I'm kind of showed a little bit about like testing some of the entity library. You might be asking yourself, well, wait a second, do I need to really test these entity state mutations? Likely not. We can probably trust that they're good to go. I will note that it might affect your code coverage if that's something that is important or necessary for your project. It's also a bit tedious to do all of these entity state mutation assertions and checking, right? Ideally, if you're not worried about code coverage, probably all you need to be concerned about is, again, if you're using the entity library, is to assert and make sure that your any manual things that you're putting into the state, that you're mutating and your reducer is doing that appropriately. So if I show you in our code, let's close this. So, I mean, if you look at some of this code, we're checking, and it gets pretty complex when you get into like updating multiple users. It can be a little complex. So this is like updating users. But then when I have to check for updating user success, I got to do a lot of code here to make sure that all this happens. So you probably don't need to actually write tests against I mean, this is like 100 lines long just to check updating multiple objects in the entity. So probably just need anything that you're adding into the state beyond the entity library is where you want to write all your code, all your tests. At least focus on those is what I would say. All right, cool. Any questions about testing Reducer? Awesome. All right, let's dive into testing NGRX effects then. So when it comes to testing NGRX effects, what we want to do is we want to model out the actions. So our actions is our hot observable. It's a stream of actions that's happening over the lifetime of our application. We also want to model out any HTTP client observables. We want to model and test dispatch actions, and we also want to model and test any actions that result in an error, where we have a catch error operator in our effect. So before we kind of dive into actually writing a test against an effect, let's kind of talk a little bit about what an effect might look like. So this is a pretty basic one. Here, this effect is for adding a user. So this is a property within a class called like user effects or something like that. And it's going to return an observable of an action. And on the action stream, we're going to pluck out any actions that are of a specific type. In this case, we're only concerned with the add user action. We're going to use the new RxJS 5.5 and now 6 pipeable operators. So on this observable, so of type returns an observable, and we'll call that pipe method, which is on the observable class. And then into the pipe, all of these are our operators that are going to be run against the observable, basically from top down, or in that order. So if we go ahead, we're going to take that action, and we're going to pluck the payload off using the map operator just to grab that payload out of the action. I'm then going to use exhaust map, and on that payload, I'm going to call the add user. That's going to return an HTTP. It uses HTTP client, and that's going to return an observable of a user, and that's what's going to come out of our user service. So we're using a REST API or whatever to make that HTTP call. We're going to go ahead and give it a payload or give it a user that we actually want to add to our database or our MongoDB or whatever we're persisting with. And so we'll give it the user off of that payload. And so out of exhaust map comes, it returns an observable of that user, return from add user. So now into my map, the second one, I'm going to get that user object, and I'm basically going to return a new action here. And the new action is going to be add user success. And then I'm giving it the actual user that's coming out, that came back from MongoDB or our REST API or database or whatever you're using. This will be dispatched because effects dispatch one or many effects unless we put dispatch false on the effect decorator. Yeah, go ahead, man.
I have a question. So the order of these operators in pipe, does it matter? So will it catch the error only from exhaust map, or it will catch from everything?
It'll catch anything in that pipe. Yep. Yeah, go ahead.
So you don't need switch map to switch to a different action there.
Yeah, I actually recently learned this, John. So you can use switch map. Exhaust map is potentially a better solution than switch map. And I'll jot that down, and I'll quickly try to explain the difference there. So let's say kind of a good example of this. Let's say I've got a button in my app that is like fetch whatever users, right? And the user clicks fetch users, and for whatever reason, the guys that wrote my REST API didn't do a very good job, but they're nice people, and it takes like 30 seconds. It takes like 30 seconds for the users to come back, right? So my user clicks it, and they're waiting, Maybe I don't, let's just say, hypothetically, I don't disable the button or put some sort of modal over it, and they can click it again. And they get impatient. They're like, geez, give me my users. They click it again, right? Well, what you're going to see, now let's say they click it again, right? So now we've got 3 clicks on the same button. And what's going to happen in Chrome, or at least in Chrome specifically, I would suspect other browsers as well, is they're going to first initiate that network request for that long-running request, right? It'll start running, right? And they click it again. Chrome will actually cancel the previous request and start a new one. So now they got to start that 30-second wait again, and then they click it again because they're frustrated. It cancels it, and it starts it again. And so what exhaust map does, instead of switch map, Switch map will allow that kind of behavior because it just keeps switching into it, if you will. Exhaust map actually, until this returns what's called a completion notification, it will just any other observable notifications that come into the pipe, it'll disregard. So clicks 2 and 3 won't matter until this completes, and then it'll say, okay, I'll take additional observable notifications.
Probably the feature of Angular, because down below it just XML HTTP request in a browser. So it doesn't matter how many requests you issue to specific endpoint.
Right.
So not in Angular you can click and get exactly the same 3 requests. So probably the feature Angular that it sees or hashes somehow that endpoint and all the data that goes to this endpoint and cancel the previous one if it's not complete yet. Because there is no reason we need another data.
Right. Yeah. So the takeaway here is exhaust map prevents anything else from coming into any other notifications until this inner observable, or this, if you will, inner observable completes. So this won't run multiple times. Does that make sense? So exhaust map is good to use with HTTP requests or any observable, inner observable that you kind of want to wait till that's done.
And there is another point in canceling previous ones, because there are only 6 requests that could be active at the same time.
Right. Yeah. Chrome has, is it 6?
6.
Or is it? I thought they were updating it to more, but yeah, only so many simultaneous requests.
And if each of those running for 30 seconds, you just do them.
Right.
Nothing.
Yeah. It's just going to sit. Yeah. So it's. I mean, and then another. I mean, this is kind of a tangent, but another argument you could just say, well, why don't you just disable the button or put some sort of modal or whatever modal dialog that blocks the UI and has a loading indicator. You could do that too, but this ensures at a very code level instead of a UI level. So,
anyways, even if you disable the button, you can always inspect the element, enable it again, and click.
if you've got a smart user that's going to take off the disabled attribute, they're really frustrated then. If they're going into their dev tools. Yeah, what's up, Yang?
Oh, but the exhaust map is probably
the
core pattern if your UI is
just
optimistic. So you say you
remove all the
can do
classes
multiple
and go
updates
directly.
in parallel, but if any one of them taking a long time and then the user are thinking, I'm going to move on to the next thing, it's going to trigger the same effects chain, that's going to block everything, right? Until that first
Yeah, it'll block anything that comes through, any other add user, right, until this issues a completion notification.
It's completely ignoring the
It just
But if you were
disregards
updating
them.
3 different users, wouldn't you want to fire those off asynchronously?
Yes, you would.
How would you do that?
not that.
Not this way. Yeah. If you wanted to load 3 users all at the same time, all at the same endpoint, then yeah, you would have to tweak this or whatever, or use a REST or an API where you could pass in multiple parameters and just issue one request. Then you would use exhaust map. But if you want all 3 of those, then you could just use switch map, and it would run all 3 of them and return them all out. But that's where you would have it.
Cancel, though. It would cancel the first 2 requests.
I think it will cancel the first 2 requests. So that's where you want to do like an add users, and then you're going to dispatch those different requests, and then use a different operator called like fork join and merge map.
Right.
I was able to handle that with like an anonymous function inside of my effect that would be triggered each time the request came through and then pushed to the subject.
Okay.
Return value.
Yeah.
So, because we were running that problem where we were trying to add in like a lot of data and it was just overriding the effects, we'd only get one actual HTTP request. So
That's interesting.
Wouldn't that require merge map? Then you can just do
Yeah, that's what you. Yeah, usually you do a pretty common pattern is like fork join and merge map. Fork join just make sure they all complete, and then use merge map outside of that to merge them all back together, and then you get them all at
I
once.
didn't have like all of my effects or actions within the effect. It was getting triggered from the store. So would merge map still work with that? Because it was just
I think-
triggering the effect like 6 times in a second, and it couldn't.
Oh, no. No, if you're triggering the effect multiple times, then you might want to refactor that to have one action and an effect that does all of the subsequent actions.
Right.
We could talk through it more in detail if you want, man.
I mean, we figured it out.
Yeah.
It was a weird issue.
Yeah. That's probably more of a design decision in terms of your actions and your effects and stuff. Ideally, you're not dispatching the same action 4 times in a row. I mean, that might be a case of, hey, wait, maybe we need to do something different.
Yeah, I mean, we were messing around with it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's tough. Effects are hard. All right, cool. And then we have a catch error. So I'm not trying to cut you off. I do want to kind of get through this all. And she's holding up these minutes, making me go faster. Cool. Yeah. So this is just like an example of what might be an effect in your application. It's a pretty common pattern. And then we do our catch error at the end. And so what we want to do is we want to be able to test this. And if you're thinking, well, geez, this is probably going to be pretty hard to test, you're kind of right. Thankfully, we have this thing called marbles, and that's what we're going to dive into here in a bit. And we want to be able to test all of this. We want to we want to mock out our action. We want to mock out our service. We want to expect this to be dispatched, or if we have a failure, we want to expect that observable to be dispatched. So model and test an observable stream. I don't know about you, but that sounds like that's not going to be a lot of fun. But thankfully we have Jasmine Marbles. So Jasmine Marbles is built on top of Jasmine. We can use it in Jest as well. And we basically just install this package using NPM or Yarn. And we'll be able to use Marbles for testing. So Marbles provides a simple way to describe observable streams. It allows us to say this is what we expect a stream to look like over the lifetime of that stream. And streams are time-based, right? So we can say things are going to happen at certain times, whether a value is emitted or a notification or a completion is emitted or an exception happens. And so we can kind of model that all out. We can use them, like I said, to model and test our observables. And we can also test subscriptions with them. It uses a scheduler underneath the hood to provide timing. And timing is done frame by frame, and you'll see this all in a second. And each character in a marble is 10 frames. And a frame is a virtual millisecond or clock cycle of the scheduler. So you've probably seen marble diagrams before. These are what are on the RxJS website when it comes to doing operators in RxJS. So real quickly, these represent values that are being emitted by our stream or values in our notifications. Multiplied by 10 might be an operator that you're running against these values. It's on an arrow, so this kind of represents time. The line here is a completion notification, meaning this stream is completed. And then this X represents an error or exception that has happened. And you can see here, if we multiply 4, that comes out as by 10, 4 comes out as 40, 6 comes out as 60. And so this kind of is a really good way when you're learning RxJS and you're studying operators to understand what they're doing and how they behave. And so I'm not sure exactly who it was, but somebody realized, hold on a second, this is also a really good way for me to describe how an observable stream is supposed to behave, and then I can run an expect statement against that. So we get marble, taking the marble diagram idea, we can write tests using Jasmine marbles, or sometimes people call them Rx marbles. Kind of, I've heard it both ways. Yeah, so the first character is always the 0 frame, a dash, and this is going to be in a string, and you'll see this in a second when we describe an observable. A dash represents the passage of 10 frames, or 10 milliseconds, or 10 ticks, if you will. The pipe, kind of like what we saw in the marble diagram, indicates a completion notification. So if you're listening to .complete. A hash or a pound sign indicates an error. Caret indicates a subscription point in a hot observable. So when somebody subscribes to an observable that's already emitting values, in other words, a hot observable. And any other character indicates an emitted value or something that's being nexted. And again, we'll kind of dive into these a little bit.
Can you put frames in context? Like what?
It's just time. So this is 10 frames or 10 milliseconds. So 10, 10, 20, 30, 40, complete, right? So, observables are a stream of data over time. And so this represents that same line, kind of like we saw in the marble diagram. And so this would be like tick, tick, value, tick, tick, complete. So I expect some amount of time, a value to be emitted, some more time, and then a completion notification to come through. So it's kind of modeling out this observable stream using a string syntax. And we'll actually be able to say what this value is if we want, right? And then I can expect, and we'll see this when we actually start writing our test, we can expect that certain observable streams look just like this, because that's what I'm expecting it to happen as a result of my effect.
The notion of time when I'm working with observable doesn't really come into play that much. It's just like whenever I emit something, I'll make sure the other end, are receiving it. I don't care the duration, right? So I'm curious to see why the notion of time, elapsed time, is so important, right?
We're just mocking out time,
Okay.
right? Because anything that's asynchronous is an observable and angular, right? So an asynchronous, the go-to is an HTTP request, right? That HTTP request could come back in 1 second, it could come back in 10 seconds, 30 seconds, or never. Or it could be an error and return a 500. But there's this idea of asynchronicity, right? Where I dispatch something or say, go do this, and then some time passes, and then I expect it to give me a value, right? And so that some time, we're just going to mock that out with these dashes. And they do become kind of important when we actually start to mock out time, because then when we expect a certain time to have lapsed based on what we give it, we need to kind of be aware of these. So you can't just put arbitrary ticks. And you'll kind of see that once we get into testing some of the effects.
You can test pretty effectively against race conditions too. So say if you have two things firing at once, you can see what happens when one thing completes first or the other thing completes first. You can test very easily for both of those.
Okay, yeah.
All right, so this example here, this is a cold observable. So we use, there's two functions, basically, hot and cold, right? This is a cold observable. This dash represents a passage of 10 frames. So this is 10 frames, 20 frames. Letter A is our emitted value, whatever it is. The pipe is our completion, and the observable here is 60 frames. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and then on the 60th frame we get a completion notification. Here's an example of a cold observable that emits an error. So again, our dashes represent 10 frames. Letter A is our emitted value, and that shouldn't say pipe. Hash represents an error, and that's our error that we're expecting to come out of our HTTP client. So we're going to issue some sort of request. We wait some time, we get a value, we wait some more time, and then we get an error. We can also have multiple values, right? So in this instance, we've got A represents a value, and then B represents a second or different value that's coming out of our observable stream. So let's actually look at a test of this effect. So we were just looking at a sample effect. I think we looked at add user. We looked at the effect where it dispatched to the service to get a user, and then as a result, it either dispatched an add success or an add user failure. And so we want to test the add effect success path first. You can do them in either order, really. But you also do want to test the failure, and we'll do that next. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to generate a user. I just have a helper function here that uses Faker that's going to generate just a user for me, just any sort of arbitrary data. I'm going to have an action. The action that we're going to be dispatching, remember before in our of type, we're expecting this add user. And I'm going to give it a user payload. And then I'm going to have an outcome, which is going to be another action, which is success, again, of a user object. So this is kind of the setup, if you will. And then now we can go ahead and do, it's a little bit more setup, but we're going to start to actually model out our streams, right? And so we know that our action stream is a hot observable, right? It's emitting values whether we subscribe to it or not, or producing values whether we subscribe to it or not. So we're going to expect I'm going to model out a stream that is a hot observable. We're going to have 10 frames or 1 tick, or 10 frames, let me just call it that, and then a value. And that value is going to be this action, this add user. So some time passes, 10 frames, and then somebody, we're modeling or mocking this out. Somebody clicked the add user button or click the submit button to add a user, and that's what would be dispatched from our component, like this.store.dispatch, and we were dispatched, and we new up add user and send that off to our store. And so this mocks that out for us. Then we're going to have 2 cold observables for the response and our value and our expected observable stream outcome. This response is a cold observable that models the response that comes from our HTTP call. So we expect the HTTP client to wait some time and then to return a value followed by a completion notification, which is 90% of the time what your HTTP client is doing, right? You say, go ahead and do this, get me something from my server. Time goes by, it says, oh, here you go, here's the value back, and immediately completes. That's what the HTTP client does.
Those A and B's must match, those tokens must match the key and the other.
In here.
Okay.
Yep. So I'm saying this value here is this action, which is that action. And then here I'm saying the value A is an actual user object. And that's what's coming back from my HTTP client.
There's no correlation with the
No, they're not. I should have probably called these A, B, and C.
Okay.
I could have called them all A. It's only within that stream. It has to be unique. So I couldn't have 2 A's here. Otherwise, well, I could. They would just be the same value or represent the same value in the stream.
So where is actions declared?
Oh, that's a good question. Do you mind if I finish
Oh, no, go ahead.
and I'll jump into the actual code and show you how I mocked out actions? Actions is, to briefly answer it, actions is what is part of NGRX. The action stream is a hot observable that's just happening all the time, right? When you're dispatching an action into this action stream. And in our effect, we inject that. Let me just show you now. We're talking about it. Let's do it. So if I look at my effect, right, you're going to inject actions, which is an observable, which is a stream of actions. I don't know if 5 minutes is going to happen. I'm sorry, Ann. I'm trying. We inject that action, and then we basically have an effect that's written for a specific action. So all of these are going to be based on that same actions, right? And then I'm going to basically filter that, say I'm only concerned, I don't care what other actions are coming through. There could be all kinds of different actions, my app. And then here I'm concerned about the load user action, and let's do something as a result of that action being dispatched.
So wouldn't you need some sort of an inject on your test?
I do.
Oh, okay.
Let me show you. Yep, and this is pretty common. So this is my test. And so what we do is we create a class called test actions, and we have this stream which is going to allow us to basically model or mock out that action stream and to give it a specific source, right? And so what we're doing, and then this get actions just news up the test action. And so then we should see this down in our add user here. This actions is an instance of that test actions class. So I need to kind of mock or wrap up that action stream because I don't want to actually work with the real one.
Those hot and cold functions, do those create observables?
Yes.
Okay, I thought that those were your expected results, but those are creating.
This is creating a hot
Observables.
observable that looks like this. This is creating a cold observable that looks like this. This is creating another cold observable.
And then you expect on those.
Yeah, because I can use this method called toBeObservable that comes as part of Jasmine Marbles, and I can expect that this add user returns an observable that looks like this observable.
I was under the impression that your strings were mocking out what you expected to see, but your strings are actually creating what you're going to be.
Yeah, they're modeling an observable stream.
Okay.
So I actually have 3 observable streams here. I've got the action stream, which is not in a test, is built by NGRX, right? It's what is basically all these actions are going into. And then I have my response stream, and this is what comes out of my service. So I'm modeling that as well. And then I'm also modeling the stream that I'm expecting to come out of the action. Because if we go back to this, I have 3 streams I'm dealing with. Here's the this is the live effect that I'm testing, right? I have an action stream, right? I'm going to model that. Then I also have an observable, a success observable, right? I expect that to come out. And I also have an observable that's returned from my add user for my service, and I need to model that as well. So I'm modeling all 3 streams, all 3 observables. And then what we're going to do is, so then we'll create this expected. This is my outcome. I'm going to expect to get this add user success out of my effect, right? That's what I'm hoping is going to happen, and then what should happen. And it should be an action of this type in that payload. And then I'm going to basically just do a mock. That's what just.fn or just that function does. So on the user service, I'm going to set add user to this rather than using the actual service, because I don't want to dispatch an actual HTTP call here, right? That would be way too expensive in my test runner. And so I'm going to model out that. And I'm going to say, let's just have that add user return this response, which is a cold observable, which after some time it emits this value, right? So rather than actually issuing an HTTP request, I'm going to mock that out. And then now finally I can say, for my add user effect, I expect that to return an observable that matches the expected, which is going to have 2 frames. Notice 1, 2. So after 2 frames, I now get my outcome, which is my add user success, right? And the reason why those are important is because the stream waited some amount of time. In this case, I decided just 1, right? And then a value. And then my HTTP call also waited an amount of time. In this case, 10 frames and a value. And so now, after 20 frames go by, and then now I get my add user success out of my effect.
That's great.
So is the action being dispatched implicitly somewhere in there? The add user?
Is the add user, when we do the effects.add user here, let me take a look at the code here. Let's see. That's a good question. I'm going to get my actions out of it, and we just set the stream on it, and I think that because it's a hot observable, it's already hot, so it's already like dispatched, if you will. So the way I think about it, I don't know if that's a really clear answer. Yeah.
If it's a cold stream you're testing,
Then I think this would fail.
you would have to trigger.
You'd have to trigger it somehow.
So you don't have to dispatch because you have the action that is going to cause the.
It's already running before you
It's
Right.
hot.
do anything.
Oh, that -A would trigger it, but when it's run for the Jasmine Marble, it's gonna.
Yes.
Okay.
And then I'm going to basically here, I'm going to just say, for this effect, for that property, I'm going to expect that value to come out.
What's the effects reference to?
That affects, here, let's just, come in and click on it. That's the actual effect,
Oh,
the class, if you will. So in our effects, that's referencing this class, and I'm expecting this add user, which is a property of that class, to basically emit that, and the resulting observable should be this add user success, because we're testing the success path. All right, the next thing we want to do is we want to test the failure path. There's not a lot different here, so I'm not going to go over every single aspect of it. But basically, notice that the outcome now is an add user fail, and we're expecting to get an error out of that. I'm going to also wire up my stream. Now my response for my HTTP client is going to be a cold observable just like it was before, but after some time passes, it just returns an error, like a 500 or whatever. It just errors out, and then after the error is a completion notification. And then I'm going to expect what's going to happen is 2 frames are going to pass, and then I'm going to get B, which is my outcome, which is my failure action, and the completion notification, and we put parentheses around that to group them into a single frame. So on the 3rd frame, we're going to get both the user fail and we're going to get a completion notification. And you might be asking yourself, well, why is it on the same frame? And the reason for that is because when we use of is really not synchronous in an observable. Of is basically synchronous, right? So whatever is out of here, of immediately, it doesn't wait any time, immediately it's an observable of that value without any time have passed, right? And so that's why we expect it on the exact same frame and we have to put them in parentheses. If I didn't have parentheses down there, I'm going to get an error and say the frames are misaligned, right? Because this is you're going to get this completion at the exact same time of the error because you're using of. Because it just wraps a value in an observable and immediately dispatches the notification. Any questions on the failure path?
Wouldn't you have to define the particular error you're looking for?
Yeah, I am right here. I just new error.
But there's no code, and you don't know if it's 500 or 400.
No, I don't really care in my effect what it is. I just know an error happened. I could try to if I wanted to, but it doesn't really matter. I mock it out, and I have it's returning this response, which is an error that comes through. It's a cold observable that returns an error. But I don't need to mock out what type of error the HTTP service responded with. It's just some error. And that's all I care about in my effect, that I'm handling that error. If I wanted to test for maybe a specific error message or something like that, maybe you could. But that's probably something that you'd want to test in your HTTP service and not in your effect. Because the effect just takes, if we look at our effect, all it does is it just takes whatever error comes out and just dispatches that error. It doesn't transform it or anything like that. So no real reason to test that.
So I noticed the typing is pretty generic here. Do we not actually care about the payload or the results there? For the proper stream is resulting?
In which instance?
Well, we've got user equals generate user.
Mm-hmm.
It's just
that's going to return a user. It's all inferred typing.
But it's pretty arbitrary. We just want the typing.
Yeah, here I'll show you. Yeah, so it knows that it's a user. Because my generate user returns a user object. It's all very strongly typed. Yep. And this add user is accepting a payload that has a user property on it that's a partial of a user. So it's all very strongly typed. I'm just not actually defining any strict types here. These are just going to be test cold observable class instances. But most of it's going to be inferred. So by the TypeScript compiler.
And on your actual actions for your payloads,
yeah.
You strongly type them, but you just always use the word payload?
I do. That's just kind of what I choose to do. I wrap everything in a single object called payload, and then I give it whatever properties I need in my payload. So like in some instances, if I'm loading a user, that payload might just be like a string. Yeah, like here. Maybe I'm loading a user based on an ID number that was in like the URL or something. Then my payload is just that ID, which is a number that I'm loading from my. Then I'm doing a REST API. I call it like /API/user/2, and just passing that along. But I wrap it all in a payload object. I don't know if that's necessarily best practices. That's kind of what the NGRX documentation does, and so I've kind of followed their pattern. So, cool. You got something for me? I saw a deep sigh. Go ahead, man.
I'm still trying to process that Marvel syntax. So
yeah.
So between the hot, the first dash name, and the second dash pound, the way to read is that are they both kind of? So I'm not saying it's gonna do a dash A and then another tick later is gonna error out. Is that the way to kind of?
There are two different streams. This is my stream that's coming through. That's my source stream, if you will. That is my actions that is ongoing from NGRX, right? Mm-hmm. And so I just give it one frame, and then I'm expecting this add user action to be emitted, right, by somebody. This represents like the user clicking something. After some time, they do whatever, and then in my code, I do this. I sort of dispatch new add user action, and that's what this represents.
Sure.
And it's hot because this stream is always hot. And then this one is the response that comes back to my server. So these are kind of separate. So after a frame, then I get an error followed by a completion, which mocks out or models out what the HTTP client would do if I requested something and I got an error back. And then finally, I'm going to expect that after 2 frames have passed, I get this new action out of my effect, which is going to be an add user fail action, which will be an which will have this as a payload, and that's what this observable is going to look like.
You don't really need the dashes, though, right? Honestly, it would work without it.
I could get rid of that dash, and both of those dashes probably.
Okay, I just,
But they represent time, and observables are time-based, so it's a good, I don't know, it's a good thing to do. It's kind of a, yeah. They're not necessary, I guess. Yeah, it's a good question. Good point. Okay. It's something that you just kind of get used to once you start getting into using them and stuff. This is a lot better and a lot easier than without Jasmine Marbles. Otherwise, you're setting all kinds of behavioral subjects up and trying to model observables over time, and it's a complete nightmare. And then you got to implement a scheduler on your own. So Marbles does some of this for us. It's actually if you look at the source code, it's pretty slim. It's just creating 2 different types of observables based on a timer, and then emitting those values based on that, or a scheduler, and then emitting those values based on that scheduler.
If you put a set timeout after the actions.stream, if you put a set timeout for like 10 milliseconds, would the user service.add user not work since you waited 10 seconds and you already piped the hot observable into the stream and the observable already ran?
Not sure. I'm not sure. You'd have to play with that.
I'm wondering when it actually starts listening to that add user function.
Yeah, you'll have to play with that. I'm not sure. It's a good question. Clone it out, throw a set timeout in it, let me know, man. Shoot me an email. All right. We good on effects? Might be a little hazy. Get home, play with it. Check out the repo. Check out some examples online. This is the general approach to modeling them out. Okay, we're almost there. Sorry, Ann, we're going. So testing selectors. So we don't really need to test the entity selectors. Again, kind of like what I said with the reducer, that's kind of built for us. So they generate selectors if you're using the entity library. So don't worry about testing them. You should test any of your own selectors. And what we primarily want to test is any sort of selector that uses what's called a projector or projects out a value. So let's look at an example of one of those, right? So this is a pretty common pattern that I've seen. Well, let's say in your state, in your store, you've got this idea of a selected user, right? And so I can get the selected user. I created a selector here that this is basically what this is going to do is going to slice out a piece of data from our store. And I'm saying for the user state, which is our entire user state object, go ahead and give me that selected ID, that selected user ID. So this is going to return just a simple number. In my instance, it could be a string if you're using string IDs. But we don't need to really test this. There's no reason to, because this is just we don't need a test create selector. It should already be tested. This is just returning my state, and this is just returning a slice of my state. I'm not really doing anything here. There's nothing to test. But what I am doing in the next instance is I'm kind of combining these, and I'm saying, okay, well, let's actually make a selector function that's going to get the selected user object, not just the ID, but the user. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get that entities dictionary from NGRX, and then I want to use this selector and get the ID. And then I'm going to use what's called a projector function here. And into that I'm going to get the entities, which is the value that gets returned from that selector, and then the user ID, which is the value that gets returned from that selector. And now that I have all my users and a specific ID, so let's say I have like 3 users with IDs 1, 2, and 3, and I select user ID 2, I want to pluck out of that entities the specific user that I've selected, right? And so now I'm going to have a projector function that takes those entities and is going to basically pluck it off of that dictionary, right? And so this is a pretty common pattern in NGRX, especially with the entity library. And so in this instance, I want to test this. I want to make sure that this doesn't break or I didn't mess something up inside of there. So I'm going to run a test for it, right? So I'm going to test that selector. So I'm going to mock out or stub out some data up here, basically just 2 users in my entity. I'm going to set the selected user to be this guy here. I generated 2 users. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to test or assert that it should return null when the entities is falsy. So if I haven't loaded any users, I can't get a selected user out of nothing, right? So it's null. So I'm going to give it null as the entities, which is null, and I'm going to give it this selected user ID, which for whatever reason, like the users came into a URL with an ID or something. So I've got an ID, but I don't have any entities loaded yet, so I'm going to expect that to be null. And that's what should come out of my selector. If I have users, if I have entities, then I should be able to get the retrieve. That's bad. I should be able to retrieve the selected user. And so what I'm going to do is now I'm going to use this projector function on the selector. So this was the selector that I created from create selector, and then I'm going to use the projector function to basically mock out that projector. And I'm going to say, well, if I'm going to run that projector, and I'm going to give it entities, which is this the 2 users up here, and I'm going to give it the selected user ID. Now that I should actually get the user back that I selected. So now I'm going to expect that to be the selected user. And so that's how we're going to go ahead and test our projected selectors. And so that's kind of a common pattern that you may want to use when you're testing projected selectors. Any questions there? Okay, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to test dispatched actions. So what we want to do here basically is we want to spy on the dispatch method on the store. We're going to invoke dispatch ourselves via the component instance in our test bed, and then we're going to assert a specific action was dispatched. So here's how we test a dispatched action. So here I have, I'm going to create an action which is going to be the select user. I'm going to tell it, go ahead and select this user with this ID. And then I'm going to create a spy on the dispatch method. And I'm going to expect that the spy is called with that action. I also want to dispatch, or I want to assert that the dispatch for the load user was called. So in this instance, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say, here's my action where I want to load a user. And again, here's the user ID or the payload for that. I'm going to spy on that dispatch. And again, I just want to expect that that method dispatch was called with that specific action. And if we look at that in our code, let's see.
Aren't you testing like the dispatch method that's like provided by NGRX library? Is that necessary?
I'm mocking it. I'm spying on it that it's called by my component. So here's what my component looks like. In ng on init, I'm loading users. Oh, this is not a specific user. Hold on. So here's my component, and I'm getting a parameter, an ID parameter in the route, in the activated route in the param map, and then I'm basically I'm testing these dispatches. I'm testing that select user is called, and I'm going to test that load user is called with those specific ID values. Right, so I'm testing that these are called as a result of this component getting an ID.
Oh, right.
So I'm testing these dispatches.
Oh, I see.
I can also do the same in like our index component. This one's just an ng. It doesn't have any sort of activated route. So in this instance, I'm just dispatching load users. I don't need any sort of ID to load them. And then I'm just going to select all users. And so if we look at the test for that, we can see kind of the same thing, right? I'm setting up an action. I'm getting the store. I'm going to spy on the dispatch. I'm going to call that ng on init. And then I just expect that dispatch to be called with the specific action. So I'm just asserting those dispatches are called. That becomes a little bit more complicated when you wrap things around it, like the activated route. So feel free to check out the code, and if you go to like the edit component, you'll see that there's a little bit more work up top in order to actually mock out the activated route and setting the param map to be a behavior subject and stuff. So there's a little bit of setup, and I don't want to go into every specific detail on these. So again, feel free to check out the repo when you actually get into testing some effects, and you can see all the setup and the test bed and all that kind of stuff, because there's a lot to setting up your test as well. Cool.
We don't see it in that component slide, but you're instantiating the component.
It's routed to. One's routed to, and one's a child component. Do you want to see it real quick? Or do you want to just believe me? So this index component here. Oh, you mean where it was instantiated in the test?
In the slide that you showed. Was I just missing it there? Or?
Oh no, it's all up above in the
Okay.
test when you configure the test bed and stuff. So this was on the index component, I think, or no, it was on the edit component test. So that's the code that you saw on the slide right there,
Okay.
I think. And if you see all up above is where we got to configure our test bed with all our necessary imports, and then we're going to use different values to mock things like the activated route and the store and the user service. Again, these are just more things that you have to kind of set up ahead of time for all your tests.
Okay.
So, yeah, and then you can see this is where the component's actually created with, it actually compiles there, and then you create the component from the test bed and all that kind of stuff.
So you've got your spy getting instantiated inside the test, but you've got all the
Yes, stuff up above too.
Up above. So
Yep.
it's just kind of catching those calls and then
Yeah, so like for example, I think with the dispatch, I'm spying on it. I just mock it out to be an empty function here
Oh, okay.
that does nothing. And then the pipe, I'm mocking out to be a hot observable in this instance as well. Yeah, so you got to kind of, I guess part of this, and I didn't want this to be too long, but part of it is also setting up your test bed, which perhaps is another talk almost, kind of because there's a lot of nuances there, right, in terms of imports and providers and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah. So feel free to check out, kind of dig through the code, and if you have any questions, you can tweet at me. My email is brian.love@breebug.com. You can email me. Breebug would be happy to come in and help you guys with this stuff as well. So,
Where's this repo at?
it's on github.com/blove,
Okay.
and then it's
GRX-testing.
is it testing? I think that's what it was.
He's looking at it.
There you go. NGRX-testing. Yeah. I hope that'll serve as a valuable resource, because I couldn't go through every line of code. But hopefully that'll be a resource for you as you're like, hey, I want to write these marble tests. I remember Brian talking about this, but how do I actually do it? And, go ahead, take a look, see how you do it.